Okay, this is a presentation to discuss the general fund formula of a district and its calculation. This is presented by the Office of Public Instruction and will be part of a public meeting on December 30th of 2020. Some terms covered in this presentation include the term budget limits, and this refers to base and maximum. Voting limits, to include highest budget without a vote and also highest budget with a vote or highest budget. The term equalization, average number belonging or ANB, and guaranteed tax base aid or GTB. Pretty frequent terms that get batted around, especially in this office, and you're more than likely to hear them more than once or twice during the session. So let's have a conversation about that. And here we go. Let's get started. If you were part of an earlier video that described a recap of the 11 budgeted funds that districts hold that have state support in them, I mentioned that about 62% of all budgeted funds reside in the budgeted fund. Reside in the general fund. So we're going to focus on that general fund a little bit. And here we go. First off, let's talk about what we term the general fund budget limits. They're limits. Don't get confused. This is an easy one. I hear this a lot. As we talk about these limits, a lot of folks believe that this is the revenue used to support these budgets. Don't think about revenue yet. What we're talking about is a calculation that's based on 20-9-308. And that section is titled Base Aid Budgets and General Fund Budget Limits. So when we talk about these limits, we're figuring out what we term base budget limit and maximum budget limit, or max. Where did this all start from? Why base and max? Well, back in 1993, there was a House Bill 667 that at the time was a bill to say that there should be disparities that are no greater than 25% from the lowest to the highest spending districts. This was intended to raise up districts who were spending lower than other districts. Apparently, the disparity was quite a bit larger at that time. And as we go through this presentation, you may see in there some of the things that were put in place. Now, since 1993, this is our current form of funding of schools and determination of limits. There's a lot of modification that's happened. It occurs pretty much every session. So let's get into it a little bit. Let's talk about base first. A base budget is the addition of these components. Special ed, which is a calculation. You take 140% of special ed allowable cost payment, 100% of data for achievement, at-risk Indian ed, the achievement gap, and the quality educator payments, and 80% of the per student entitlement and basic entitlement. Let's not worry about what those things represent just yet. We'll get to those. But if you add that together, that's the calculation in 20-9-308 that once added together determine what the base budget limit is set at. Let's talk about the maximum budget limit. Well, this time let's start from the bottom. It's 100% of the basic and per student entitlement. It's also 100% of the other entitlements that I mentioned that were also set at 100%. And the special ed allowable cost payment, the calculation really lands somewhere between 175 and 200% of what the calculated special ed allowable cost payment actually is. This time, add those components up, and that's how the maximum budget limit is set. A term that becomes important that gets discussed is anytime there's discussion surrounding any part of a district's general fund budget that is greater than base, it's termed over base. You may notice my bracket extends past that maximum budget level. It was done intentionally. Districts actually have the ability to adopt budgets that surpass the max budget limit. We'll talk about that more as well. Also want to note, all districts are required to adopt a budget that is at least the base budget. And that goes back to that earlier slide that I was showing you that talks about bringing the disparity somewhere up to no more disparity than 25%. Okay, so here again are the components that are utilized in determining what we term general fund budget limits. So let's talk about those for a little bit. You may hear a lot of discussion about average number belonging. And if you're not hearing about average number belonging, you're more than likely hearing about enrollment and enrollment fluctuations and variations. So what does enrollment have to do with any of this? Well, we're going to get to that in a minute, but enrollment helps to determine what average number belonging is. And average number belonging is used in a bunch of these components. I hope you're able to pick out which ones they are, but here they are. Your special ed allowable cost payment uses average number belonging, data for achievement, Indian Ed, the per student entitlement, and yes, also the basic entitlement, all have requirements of average number belonging. And backing up before average number belonging calculation, enrollment collection that occurs twice a year for the purposes of determination of average number belonging. Let's dive into that. So what is average number belonging? Well, there's a fall collection of enrollment that occurs on the first Monday in October. There's also an enrollment collection that happens on the first Monday of February. We'll talk about those as fall and spring enrollments. You take both of those enrollment collections and you sort of limit out the folks that do and don't count towards the calculation of A and B, meaning students who are under 5, students who are older than 19, students that attend part-time, that those part-times are quarter, half, 3/4, and full-time. There's a little bit more adjusting that goes on there. We don't have to get into that. But that calculation, or who gets to be included and who doesn't, is all governed through 20-9-311, which is the calculation of average number belonging. You take the two counts of enrollment, you average them together, and then you multiply it by the number of pupil instructional related days. It's usually 7. You take the product of that and divide it by 180. And that is what becomes the calculation or the determination of average number belonging. But it doesn't just stop there. what I just described is a thing that's called current year A and B. There's also a portion that is termed the 3-year average A and B. And how that is determined is you take the current year A and B value and the current year A and B value from the prior year and the current year A and B value from the year prior to that prior year. And you average the three. You average the three, and that then is termed 3-year average A and B. But there's a little bit more. What happens is the A and B that determines the highest or best budget for the district, be it either current year A and B or 3-year average A and B, the one that produces the best or most beneficial budget to the district then is termed budget limitation A and B. So budget limitation A and B is always either the current year calculated A and B or the 3-year average A and B. And the budget limitation A and B is the A and B that is used to determine a district's budget. Okay, so now we're back around to these components. And as I said earlier, a lot of these components utilize that A and B in their formula. So let's take a look at this for a couple seconds. Basic entitlements. The basic entitlement formula, or the numbers that are in statute, are in a section called 20-9-306. And if you go in there and read that section of law, it will say the basic entitlement is set at, for elementary schools, $53,000, $541 in 2021 and every year beyond, plus an additional $2,678 for every 25 students past the first 250. So you get the basic entitlement for 250. Then if you have an additional 25 students, an additional 2,678 is added. And you can take a look. There's different rates for middle school and high school as well. The second component is called the per student entitlement. Same section of law governs this, 20-9-306. You can see these numbers in that section of statute. What it'll say is the per student entitlement is set at $5,727 for the first student who walks through the door. The second student who walks in gets that same amount minus 20 cents, and so on, and so on, and so on, all the way down to the 1,000th student who walks through the door. At that point, all students garner the same value at that rate. So that's what a lot of times you hear are termed the decrement. And there's two separate decrements. There's one for elementary school students and there's one for high school students. Quality educator is a little simpler. It's full-time equivalents. These are licensed teachers and staff. Currently, they gather $3,335 per FTE. The at-risk component is a set amount and it's proportionately distributed to all 398 operating districts across the state. Proportionality is determined through the amount of Title I funding that the district has reported as received in the prior year. Indian Ed for all is determined by budget limitation A and B times 2236. The achievement gap payment is self-identified Indian students in the prior year times 220. Data for achievement is 2141 times budget limitation A and B at the district. Let's talk about special ed allowable cost payment in the next slide. We'll do that one briefly. So if we think back to an earlier conversation where we were discussing limits, well, those limits were the addition of these components to each district for base and max. And as you can see, the size of them will all be determined based on the calculations that determine the size of each one of those components through 20-9-306. So a little bit more on this. Oops, I said on the next slide, but I'm going to take a pause from that for a second. There's a section of law I'm going to point out. It's 20-9-326, and it is titled the Annual Inflation-Related Adjustments to Basic Entitlements and Per A and B Entitlements. And what this is including is everything in the bracket. So just like my previous presentation where I brought in the executive's budget, and it says that there's an increased request for base aid, and it's around $24 million. Well, what is happening here is there's a consumer price index inflationary adjustment that is required through 20-9-326, and it affects everything that's in the circle on the right. Now, you might be able to do some math real quick and realize that, well, if I add these all up and I multiply it up by the number of A and B across the state, it's not going to be a full $24 million. There's additional adjustments made for other variables, such as enrollment projections, taxable value projections, some various non-levy revenue projections. And so it's an estimate of the need for going forward into the next biennium. But the inflationary adjustment is set in law, and the executive budget is adjusted accordingly. And that's where a portion of what you're seeing in the executive budget for the next 2 years is residing. Okay, as I promised, we would talk about the special ed allowable cost payment. Now, the special ed allowable cost payment is not a part of that base aid increase request. Rather, it sets out on the side on its own. And what happens is the legislature appropriates an amount to be put towards the special ed allowable cost payment distribution. And in law, it states that that appropriation will be distributed in the following proportions to school districts and cooperatives, special ed cooperatives. 25% of it is for the instructional block grant. And what we do is we take the appropriation, determine what 25% of that is, divide it across the number of current year A and B in the state, and that allows us to distribute about $153 per current year A and B student to the instructional block grant. Related services block grant is very, very similar. There's a disproportionate cost reimbursement that is a distribution to schools. Oh, I said the wrong thing, darn. It's 52.5% that goes to the instructional block grant. The 25% is for the disproportionate cost reimbursement. My apologies, I'm glad I caught it. Basically how that works is districts that have disproportionately high costs for expenditures for special needs students that report those expenditures to the state then can qualify to have a reimbursement for mitigating the excessive costs that were incurred 2 years prior to the budget year. There's also a cooperative reimbursement, and that's 5%. And there's a section of law that determines its calculation. I don't want to get into it right now. We can if you want to after this when we have a discussion. Okay, so I think that's a good, solid discussion about how you calculate your base budget and your maximum budget. So let's move on a little bit. Next topic. I'm going to move this bar over here so that we can express it a little bit different. We're going to talk about general fund budget voting limits. Now, these aren't budget limits, they're voting limits. And they're important because those voting limits help to govern how big or small a district's budget can be. It also helps to determine what goes into property taxes. We'll talk about that more here in a second. So what portion of this budget would need to be voted? What portion of it is, I don't like using the word permissive, non-voted or required, and what portion of it would be required to be voted if a district chose to go for a certain level of budget. Okay, now that you're super confused, let's go through it. If there's any levy in the base of a budget, it's termed to be permissive, meaning it's not requiring a vote. And it's not even just permissive, it's required to support the base budget. If you recall earlier, I said all districts are required to have a budget that is at least at the base level. And so if there's any need of levy, it's a required levy. And yeah, it doesn't need to be voted, and therefore it's permissive. Let's increase that base budget by what we like to term the 5-year look back. You're not going to find that term in statute. You're also not going to find the term permissive levy over base in statute. It's just some terms we've concocted so that we know what we're talking about when we have these discussions. Really what it is if a district had a voted levy in previous years, they can now permissively collect it for up to 5 years going forward if it doesn't surpass the highest budget amount. So this portion is permissive. Additionally, if a district estimates some non-levy revenues, such as tuition, oil and gas, to fund the overbase, excess reserves used to fund the overbase, and another little thing called the flexible non-voted levy authority, all of those things, if estimated to fund a budget, could increase what is termed the highest budget without a vote, meaning a district can adopt this budget at their district for their general fund without going out and asking voters for a levy. So any levies associated in here are permissive. So what about the highest budget, or what they term the highest budget with a vote? Well, let's go through that. There's a piece of law out there, and it says that districts have the right to adopt either the district's calculated maximum budget in that year, or they can adopt the prior year adopted budget with adjustments. I'm not going to get into the adjustments. So they have a choice. You can adopt either the highest budget would be either the max budget or the prior year adopted budget, whichever is higher. So if you think about that, if I have a district that has declining enrollment and the calculation of the max budget or the maximum budget limit is there, well, with less A and B, as we discussed, perhaps the maximum general fund budget level might be less than the adopted budget of the previous year. And so we have districts that are able to achieve budgets that are greater than the maximum general fund budget limit because they're adopting the prior year's adopted budget. And so what happens is these districts are over max. The only way you can adopt the budget, though, oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, here's a little cut in. I forgot to mention this. This follows right along. So here's a grid. This shows a count of the districts across the state by what is termed equity status. And if you remember, the first slide of this presentation was about equity. And so we have 139 districts that are currently over max. There's nothing wrong with this. I'm not shooting it down. I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I'm just pointing out that because we had multiple years of declining enrollment, districts had the authority to achieve these over max budget by adopting the prior year adopted budget. We have 139 districts that are over the maximum calculation. So I get this question a lot. They think that the budget limits are base and max and you can't go past max. Well, it's just a term, and yes, you can. Okay, so back to the bar. It says this area that is above the highest budget without a vote is termed the highest budget with a vote, or a lot of times it's just called the highest budget amount. So districts can adopt this amount, but it might require voter approval to get there. So all the other voted levy portions were permissive or required. This area would be what you see on a ballot saying, hey, we'd like to increase we'd like to levy a little bit more this year. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get to this highest budget level so that they can have enough funds to run their district. Okay, next topics. We talked about base and max, those are budget limits. We talked about voting limits, which is highest budget with and highest budget without a vote. So now we know the levels of budget, where the bottom is, everybody needs base, and where the highest is, the highest budget. Let's talk about how that all gets funded now. Here we go. Well, in the base portion of a budget, direct state aid is supportive from the state for the base of a district. And how it's calculated is you take the per student entitlement and the basic entitlement. We talked about those calculations earlier. You add them all up, and then you take 44.7% of that amount, and that is the amount of direct state aid that the state supports the district with. So the remainder then, well, the remainder most of the time is local property taxes to support the base. Also supporting that base, the quality educator payment, the at-risk payment, the Indian Ed for All payment, the achievement gap payment, the data for achievement payment, special ed allowable cost payment at 100%. The remainder, remember, it was 140% in the base. So 100% state paid, the extra 40% local property taxes. Okay, so this is all state funded stuff. So I didn't fill up my base yet. And I told you that you had to adopt a budget at least base. So what's the rest? Well, here's the rest. Unreserved fund balance reappropriated. If you were in my earlier presentation, I mentioned that this is money left over at the end of the prior year that rolls forward to help support the base budget. Base non-levy revenues, we discussed those in an earlier presentation. Oil and gas estimated revenue, coal, interest earnings, some other things. And then the remainder is supported through a property tax levy and another state-funded component called GTB, or Guaranteed Tax-Based Aid. Also, to fund this budget, and by the way, I'm going to come back to discuss GTB in more detail in a few minutes here. Also supporting the over-base portion of the budget. Remember, if you voted a levy, it now becomes permissive and it can be used to support the overbase. Flexible non-voted levy authority, That's a discussion for a different day, but it's also levied funds. They support the overbase. Additionally, estimated tuition, oil and gas to fund the overbase, excess reserves to fund the overbase. There's a couple other things, maybe not. And then anything over and above that is a voted levy that would require the district to go out and seek an overbase levy to gain the authority to adopt possibly the highest budget. If you don't want to go out for the vote, nobody's telling you have to. Instead, now you can just adopt the highest budget without a vote. So looking at the color combinations here, everything in blue is levy funds. Everything in tan is state support for school districts. The green, non-levies. The rusty reddy orange is, you could think of it as non-levy, but it's termed fund balance reappropriated. So all these revenues together go to support whatever adopted budget the district chooses to adopt. Let's go back to GTB for just a minute. I always want to explain this, and I never feel like I can. So here's my chance. Guaranteed tax base aid is a way for lower property tax wealth areas of the state or districts in comparison to that of the statewide average of property tax wealth. It's a way for those particular districts to gather an additional, raise the mill value of their particular district because your mill value is associated with its taxable value. It's a way for increasing the value of that mill so that there's more of an equalizing effect on the value of your district's mill. I think I butchered that to death. Let's take a look at it in more detail. Maybe this will help. Here's how it works. It's a real simplified version though. First thing you have to do is you have to determine the statewide ratio. What's that mean? Well, that means essentially this. You take the statewide's taxable value, and then you take the GTB area of the state, and you take a ratio of those two, and then you take that ratio and you multiply it up by using a multiplier. Okay, knowing what the value of the state is assessed or determined, and that's not hard to understand. So it's the full taxable value of the entire state divided by the GTB area. What's that? Well, that's set in Law 2. It's 35.3% of the calculated basic and per entitlements. Remember, direct state aid was 44.7. Well, here's the remainder of it. This is the portion of the calculated basic and per entitlements that would fall on to the local property taxpayer. Remember, we talked about special ed and we said that the base is 140% of the special ed allowable cost payment, 100% paid by the state. The remainder would be the burden of the local property taxpayer. And so these things together, the portion of the base that is the responsibility of the local property taxpayer, that's the piece that they're responsible for. So you take the statewide taxable value, divided over the property tax burden area, determine that ratio, and then elevate that ratio by some percent. Well, currently the elevator is called a multiplier, and in 2021 and beyond, it's set at 232% of whatever that first ratio calculates. And so you can see in the example there for elementary schools, right in the middle of the screen, elementary for 2021, there's the taxable value, $3 billion, divided by the local taxpayer's burden area of a general fund, and multiplied up by 232%. That value is 72.95. Okay, so what do you do with that? Well, second. Now what you do is, and I'm using an example of Townsend, I just happened to pick them. You take a look at the elementary side. It's done elementary and high school, even when they're K-12 districts. And you take the statewide ratio and you multiply it by now comparing it to the district taxable value, or I'm sorry, the district's GTB area minus the district's taxable value at a mill. And so what you're doing really is taking whatever the elevated statewide ratio is, and you're comparing that to the same thing calculated for a district. If the district qualifies through this calculation to receive funds to help support the property tax burden in the base of a district's general fund, it works out this way for this particular district. On its elementary side, for every base mill the district levies, they get $15,000 $1511 for every base mill levied. And that is to help support the property tax burden for the district. What if the calculation yields a negative number? Well, if it yields a negative number, it means that the district's taxable wealth is greater than the average of the state, including the multiplier, and therefore the district doesn't qualify to receive guaranteed tax base aid in its general fund. So let's do a little exampling here. There's 398 operating schools in 2021. Currently, 332 of those districts receive guaranteed tax base aid in their general fund. So what I've done here is I did a little let's imagine. I have districts A through L. And let's say I sorted those districts. Imagine that it is all 398 of them. And what I did is I sorted them from taxable wealth that is the greatest to the lowest. And if you notice, the green is supposed to represent base property taxes. And the guaranteed tax base aid in support of that base area is the blue. So currently, with a statewide ratio multiplier set at 232%, a lot of districts receive state support for the base property tax area. This creates property tax equalization. Let's think about this a little bit further. Imagine, for instance, that somebody made the decision to increase the multiplier. Well, if you increase the multiplier, it does two things. It allows more districts to receive support in their property tax area, and it also increases the amount of support to the base of everybody else's district general fund. Let's go the other way around. Let's say we lower that multiplier. Well, if you lower the multiplier, it does two things again. It lowers the amount of guaranteed tax base aid to each district, they receive less. And it also lessens the number of districts who qualify to receive a certain amount of GTB. Okay, with that, that comes to the conclusion of this presentation. I hope it was beneficial. So in recap, we talked about how you calculate budget limits. We talked about the voting limits. We also talk about all the support to support the budgets of the districts for the general fund. So there's a variety of things that help support them. I hope it was informative and helpful to you. Thanks a lot.